Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure to talk to you about metabolism. Metabolism is a term that we've heard before, but maybe we haven't considered so much. It's simply the total sum of all the chemical reactions that occur within all of our cells. And so one can imagine that's rather critical. And so we're going to have a conversation about that. And so, one of the things that we like to study in biology is chemistry. And so, sometimes students wonder about that. But the truth is, biology really is just a series of chemical reactions. And so it's organized this way. And so we consider metabolic pathways as being the total summation of this. And so there's different pathways. And I want to consider pathways and use the analogy of a road map. So in other words, if you're in a city, you can go one direction, you can go several blocks straight, you could turn right, you can turn left. So it's sort of like a map. And so it's an elaborate road map of these chemical interactions. And so just really basically, I put one right here. You might be familiar with the fact that the reactant in a chemical reaction in biology, we refer to it as a substrate. And so what it produces is a product. So we have reactants becoming products, and there's a chemical change. In other words, bonds are broken and new bonds are formed. We often have biological catalysts, principally enzymes, that speed up these chemical reactions. In other words, they provide the right three-dimensional structure for substrates to collide, and therefore products are produced. And so this is what we mean by a pathway, and that I can label this and say that A, let me turn down that a little bit, A can produce B, and then B becomes the substrate for C, and then D, and then the product of this pathway is E. So if I were to write it out, for example, linearly, I might say something like this. I might say that A produces B, produces C, produces D, and then produces E. So this is what we mean by a pathway. And so each of these, as shown in that other illustration, is catalyzed by a particular enzyme. And every one of these is unique. In other words, this enzyme will only have I's for A. We can call it A ACE for short, or B ACE, or C ACE, etc. So this is a linear pathway. But then, things can get more interesting. We could have branches coming off of it like this. We could say something like this is occurring. And then what's even more fascinating is that you can have other chemical reactions that are cyclic in nature, or cycles like this, and you can go around like that. And so in other words, it's the end product is at the starting point. And so that may not make sense, but there's a really cool pathway that we're going to be studying in the breakdown of carbohydrates and even proteins and fatty acids that occurs in the mitochondrial matrix called the Krebs cycle, which is cyclic in nature. And so what's fascinating is that you can have linear pathways leading to cyclic pathways, and you can have branching. So it's an elaborate roadmap inside the cell. And so, I can go with that and say, all of this is occurring, within the cytoplasm of the cell. And then I can further say that some cool chemical reactions, like I mentioned, the Krebs cycle occurs within membrane-bound organelles like the mitochondria. And then some reactions occur in the cytoplasm. Some chemical reactions specifically occur in chloroplasts. Some chemical reactions occur in lysosomes. And so these are specific environments within the cell that are maximized or most conducive to optimize that particular chemical reaction. So very cool. All of biology comes down to metabolism. How do you like that? So one of the pathways that I was mentioning just a moment ago with the breakdown of carbohydrates, it begins with glucose, and this occurs in the cytoplasm, so it's like a roadmap. It's about a 10-step chemical reaction called glycolysis, and the first two steps are shown. And so it goes all the way down into the product happens to be something called pyruvic acid, and then that enters into the mitochondrial matrix where you can see a cyclic reaction occurring here. So metabolism is like this roadmap, and it's these pathways, like you can see in this picture here, where the green triangle, the substrate, reacts, and it interacts with enzyme 1. It becomes the intermediate substrate A, and then that becomes the intermediate B, and then that produces the final product. So this is what we mean by a pathway. And then we said that enzymes, which are shown here in gray, accelerate the process. But sometimes, to be perfectly clear, if there's a lot of end product, we wouldn't really want the pathway to be accelerated. Perhaps the better term to describe what enzymes are capable of doing is that they regulate pathways. In other words, they can speed them up or slow them down, depending. It's like, for example, if the end product is in high concentration, there's a lot of accumulation of end product, perhaps it feeds back and binds allosterically to another site of an enzyme. It doesn't perhaps interfere with the active site, which is where the substrate binds and the chemical reaction occurs, but maybe somewhere else. So it temporarily, and this is the key, temporarily alters the shape, the three-dimensional tertiary conformation of the protein, therefore slowing the pathway down to produce itself. So that's kind of neat, that it actually regulates its own production by interfering with the pathway, enzyme 1. Why enzyme 1 more efficient than if it did enzyme 2 or 3? Because the regulation occurred early in the pathway. That's kind of cool. So enzymes early in pathways can be regulated often by the end product. And so that determines the appropriate balance of supply and demand. And so metabolism is pretty cool this way. And so another thing that I want to say about metabolism is that you can sort of characterize all chemical reactions as either being chemical reactions that break down complex molecules into simpler ones and often release energy in so doing, or the converse of that are anabolic. In other words, building smaller molecules together, usually requiring energy to build complex molecules. And so really this video is about catabolic and anabolic chemical reactions, which make up the totality of metabolism. So what I wanted to say is, you know, everyone's familiar with the fact that we eat food and we break down complex molecules into simple ones, like, for example, sugar. But what's interesting about that is that the energy that we get from sugar is then stored in an organic molecule called adenosine triphosphate, and then that's used later by the cell to provide the energy source for anabolic pathways. In other words, ones requiring the buildup of things, like, for example, or motion, like running. And so this simple cartoon is fairly useful, that it usually requires energy to build complex things, and then energy is released when molecules are broken down. And so again, anabolic are pathways in which build up molecules from simple molecules to more complex ones. And there's pathways to do this as well. You might have heard of the term anabolic steroids, and then those are a class of steroids that prompt cells to initiate anabolic pathways. And so that's kind of interesting. And so it really comes down to this. You know, we've been talking about energy, breaking things down, building things up, requiring energy, but let's keep things perfectly clear. Organisms can either create or destroy energy. It's the law of conservation of energy. What organisms do is that they transform the energy from potential energy to kinetic energy, and from kinetic energy into potential energy. And so this is what we say, energy, the definition of energy is the ability to do work. And so energy can be rearranged, if you will. And so what we talk about the energy of motion, we talk about the energy of kinetic energy. This might be familiar with you somewhere in your past, but it's the energy of motion. So if something's moving like a roller coaster, it's exhibiting kinetic energy. And so the energy and heat is a great example of that as well. the energy of potential is an energy based on its location. Like, for example, this roller coaster in a physics example would have the greatest potential energy when it's at the crest of this particular, whatever this roller coaster structure. So right up here, it had the greatest potential energy. And then that potential energy is then converted into kinetic energy, when the energy of motion when it's moving down. So these two things are equal. Potential energy equals kinetic energy. I'll mention that a little bit later, but I had to throw it out there. So oftentimes in biology, chemistry, we don't think about potential energy as so much position, but rather in chemical form. And so we like to think of it as the potential energy that molecules possess in the arrangement of the chemical bonds. We say that sugar has potential energy. Triglycerides have potential energy. So when they're combusted and converted into something simple, like in a catabolic reaction, energy is released. And then that energy can be used to produce ATP, which is another potential energy molecule. So again, back to the physics, it's like this little guy here. He goes up to the top of the slide and he's cruising down. When he's at the top of the slide, he climbs the ladder, he has the greatest amount of potential energy, though it took kinetic energy to get him up there. And then when he comes back down, he's converting the potential energy into the kinetic energy. And so it's the energy of motion. But a lot of this energy is lost in the form of heat. And so I want to reference a little video clip on this that I think is pretty useful. And I'm actually going to let this play because I think the narration is pretty useful.
Is the capacity to perform work. Potential energy is energy that is stored. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, but converted from one form to another. This property is called the conservation of energy. The bow and arrow start out with low potential energy. As the archer's arm pulls back the string, kinetic energy from the arm's motion is converted to potential energy in the tense bowstring and arrow. When the bowstring is released, the stored potential energy is converted into the kinetic energy of the moving arrow. When the arrow hits the target, its motion ceases. If energy is neither created nor destroyed, where did the energy of the flying arrow go? Let's rewind and look at kinetic energy in more detail. When energy is converted from potential energy to kinetic energy, some of the energy can be used to do work, but some energy ends up as heat, a type of kinetic energy. Heat is the random motion of atoms and molecules. As the arrow flies through the air, heat is generated by friction between the arrow and air molecules. When the arrow strikes the target, all the energy becomes heat energy. The heat energy is rapidly transferred into the air and spreads out. Heat energy is a very disordered kind of energy.
The heat.
It has the highest amount of entropy, or disorder, of any kind of energy. Where do our muscles get energy to perform work, such as pulling back a bowstring? Our bodies use the chemical energy from food to perform work. Chemical energy is a form of potential energy. When your body breaks down food molecules, the stored potential energy from food can be converted to kinetic energy. The stored chemical energy in food is released in your muscle cells during the process of cellular respiration. Using oxygen, cellular respiration converts chemical energy from food to another form of chemical energy called ATP.
Just want to pause it. The ATP is also potential energy as well. So the food potential energy is stored into the potential energy of ATP, and then that's going to convert into the kinetic energy of this guy moving his muscles, and therefore creating the potential energy of the bow.
Water, H2O, and carbon dioxide, CO2, are byproducts of cellular respiration. The potential energy of ATP can be converted to kinetic energy. Some of the kinetic energy is used to do useful work, such as pulling back a bowstring, but the heat energy that is generated cannot be used to do work.
And so that's something that we want to talk about too, is that loss of heat. Because that heat, though it's conserved energy, heat is accounted for, but it's not useful, that particular heat. And so it's considered to be kind of lost, if you will, or increasing entropy, which is something else we want to talk about. So, don't no worries about this whole idea of glucose being converted into ATP. This will come in future discussions. It's a great one. And so I just wanted to point out the fact that when sugar is broken down, or it could be protein or triglycerides, but when organic potential energy containing molecules are broken down in respiration, in other words, reacted with oxygen, broken down into simpler compounds, that conversion is made in mostly, it happens in the cytoplasm, but mostly in the mitochondria. So ATP is produced. And so this is also chemical energy as well. And then what's fascinating is over here, you can see in photosynthesis, energy from the sun is used to store the energy of the sun into carbohydrates. And so that's primarily what's occurring there, that pathway. And so ultimately what organisms are doing is converting and transforming energy, transforming sugars into energy, ATP, and then motion, and then likewise heat is produced. And so ultimately energy is, this is the weird thing that we're going to need to talk about, energy is constantly needs to flow through the ecosystem, if you will, because its energy isn't lost technically, but the quality is lost, because it eventually dissipates in the form of heat. And so this brings up the conversation that I want to have about thermodynamics. And so thermodynamics is such a huge concept in science that it sort of transcends biology. It's kind of, it really exists in the domain of physics and chemistry, but biology follows these rules of the laws of thermodynamics, and so we discuss them. And so here it is. It's the energy transformations that we've been talking about already. And so there's two laws at play here in thermodynamics. And the first one I've already kind of been kicking around, which is the first law is potential energy equals kinetic energy. So you cannot create nor destroy energy. It's always converted. And so that conversion back and forth is dynamic, thermodynamic, back and forth. Kinetic energy, potential energy. Kinetic energy, potential energy. It can flow back and forth. But this is the cool thing. The second law of thermodynamics states that this energy transfer makes the universe more disordered each time. And again, you might be familiar with this somewhere in your past. This is referred to as entropy. It's the quality or the randomness. And so increased entropy is increased disorder. In other words, the universe takes the form of increasing heat. And so molecules are becoming more disorganized through heat. Heat is the random molecular motion. And so usually chemical reactions will manifest themselves, not all of them, but the ones that are becoming more disorderly are producing products that are more randomized. And so heat is one of those examples of it being more randomized. And so I know that that's kind of, sounds a lot like, babble and sort of philosophical conversation, but let's do a couple of examples for a sec. So the potential energy that we put into our car in the form of gasoline can be combusted, in other words, with oxygen, and ignited into carbon dioxide water, and it's going to produce energy, the combustion of gasoline, and that's going to be converted into the kinetic energy of motion of the car. Okay, we're familiar with this. But most of the combustion of gasoline actually creates heat. And so though potential energy equals kinetic energy, we still have to keep putting gasoline in the car because a lot of the energy is lost in the form of heat. And you might say to yourself, whoa, automobiles convert only 25% of the energy of gasoline into motion. And so that's why we have a coolant system. this car obviously needs a better coolant system, but because there's a lot of heat generated as a result of this combustion. But see, and you're like, well, cars are very inefficient. I'm sure cells are a lot more efficient. Not necessarily. So when you combine the two laws of thermodynamics, you say that the quantity of energy is constant, but the quality is not. And so, as you may be familiar with in the study of ecology, organisms aren't that much more efficient. Like, for example, the sun comes in to producers and forms carbohydrates, but at each trophic level in the feeding chain, there's only 10% of the energy is available to the next trophic level. 90% is lost. And that has to do with, again, the heat generated from the burning and combustion of food as well. And also, technically, there's some losses in the form of feces as well when organisms aren't able to digest all of the sugar, and so that doesn't actually convert to the next trophic level. So, to truth be known there. So, heat is energy, but it's in its most random state, and so therefore it's lost. And so, we talk about in a chemical reaction, we say that if a chemical reaction occurs spontaneously, that means that it's going to happen without any outside help at all. Okay, so that's going to be a useful concept that we're going to work with in a moment. A non-spontaneous chemical reaction or process only occurs if energy is added to the system to get it to go. And so here's a term, enthalpy. Okay, not entropy. Entropy was disordered as measured by S for entropy. Enthalpy, as measured by the letter H, is the thermodynamic potential, meaning the heat that is either generated or is required in a chemical reaction. And so you may recall this. In order to really get a handle of entropy, or the heat of a reaction, you really are looking at really the difference between the amount of energy required to break bonds and the amount of energy released when new bonds form. So one considers enthalpy as a delta H, in other words, a change, the Greek symbol delta for change. So it's really a change in the measure of heat in the chemical reaction. And so we talk about potential energy, for example, in a candle is converted to the chemical energy of heat and light. And again, there's no there's no violation here. PE equals KE, of course, but entropy is increasing because the heat energy is more random. So this would be, if I were to illustrate this, let me say that, potential energy, let's make that a little bit, let's make that a little bit thicker, if I can do that. Let me come over here. Let's say that the potential energy equals the kinetic energy, of course, right here, but the entropy, the S, the randomness is increasing, okay? And in this chemical reaction, the energy is being released, heat energy is being released, and so we say that there's a negative change in enthalpy. There's a release from this chemical reaction. Now, interestingly enough, over here with this ice pack, you might be familiar with this. Like, for example, if you hurt yourself on a hike, you could use one of these instant ice packs. Chemical reaction occurs, and it actually consumes heat from the outside environment, and it actually becomes colder. And so, as a result, it is not releasing heat, but it's requiring heat. So this would be a positive delta H chemical reaction. And so these two terms are fairly useful as well. In other words, a chemical reaction that's releasing heat is referred to as an releasing heat, exothermic process. And one that is requiring heat is an endothermic. In other words, it's getting cold. And so the change is, this is a negative delta H, this is a positive delta H, right there. And so to summarize, not to just summarize, but to add these two concepts together, the two concepts meaning entropy and enthalpy. We could say that there's a physicist by the name of Gibbs, and so we call this free energy, and that's why the symbol G comes from this, Gibbs. So in a system is related to the total enthalpy and entropy, so H and S. There's this relationship. So the free energy is equal to H minus TS, whereas T is temperature, and the units are Kelvin in this example. So, what does it mean? It means that, for example, a chemical reaction is going to occur spontaneously or non-spontaneously. If there's a release in free energy, it's going to be a spontaneous reaction, and if there's a positive Gibbs free energy, it's going to be non-spontaneous. And so this is what we want to consider. And so check this out. For a system to be spontaneous, then the system has to give up energy. In other words, it has to be a decrease in H. Let me illustrate that. Okay, so it has to be a negative delta H. Oops. Don't mean to do that. Let me see if I can go back here. Sorry about that. So if the reaction's spontaneous, it's going to be a negative delta H, so it's going to be a decrease in H, and it's going to be an increase in entropy. In other words, it's going to be more reactive. In other words, the products are more random. That's what I meant to say. The products are more random, so there's an increase in entropy at this. And so the delta G is the summation of these two things. So in other words, the reaction will occur spontaneously if this is the situation. And so maybe it's more understood if you look at a graph like this. And so when we talk about Gibbs free energy and we consider entropy and enthalpy, we're not just talking about the heat of the reaction, but we're looking at disorder as well. And so instead of calling it exothermic, we could say that it's exergonic. And instead of saying endothermic, we could say it's endergonic. Okay, so check this out. If you have reactants that have a form of potential energy, and they react, and they're, as you can see here, as the reaction goes on, there's a release of energy. Okay, so there's a release of energy, and so this is going to be a negative delta H, and if the products are more random, it's going to be a positive delta S. And this is the measure of the energy released during the chemical reaction. Okay, so we could say that up here, this would be 0, and this would be a positive delta G, and this would be a negative delta G right here. So a release of Gibbs free energy. And so this is important. Like a practical example of this in biology would be like if we're combusting sugar, for example, like the burning of sugar. The oxidation of glucose produces carbon dioxide in water, but as you know, it also it occurs spontaneously. In other words, it doesn't require any outside input of energy. Doesn't necessarily mean spontaneous doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go quickly. That's why we need enzymes to speed up the rate of the chemical reaction, because there's an activation energy barrier that needs to occur to break these bonds. Okay, so usually a flame is necessary to activate this, but it will occur spontaneously, although very slowly. Like for example, paper burning. It's just going to occur in the presence of oxygen. So it has a negative delta G, and it happens to be, just to throw out some numbers, so negative 686 kilocalories per mole. That's the amount of energy released in this chemical reaction. And so an endergonic one, again, requires energy from the outside. So it's a positive delta G because, as it turns out, the products are more organized. And so watch this, it's a negative delta S. So the products are more organized, and ready for this? It's a positive delta H. In other words, energy is required to produce the products. This is non-spontaneous. This will not occur unless energy is provided by the outside environment to get this to occur. So energy input is required, and it's non-spontaneous. And so we could say that in nature, Photosynthesis requires the energy of the sun in order to store the energy in the form of glucose. And so that's why it's an endergonic reaction, or it's an anabolic pathway, if you want to consider it that way. And so that's pretty neat. And then I want to conclude this video. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing. This is pretty helpful too. It's a summation of what we were just talking about in terms of chemical reactions, and it's a little foreshadowing in terms of enzymes. I mentioned enzymes a little bit, but they're coming in another video shortly. So let's check this out. It's pretty good.
Reaction to occur, even one that releases energy, some energy must be added to get the reaction going. This energy is needed to break bonds in the reactant molecules. The energy needed to start a chemical reaction is called the energy of activation, EA. This required energy input represents a barrier that prevents even energy-releasing reactions from occurring without some added energy.
So even
How does a living
spontaneous
cell
ones.
overcome the energy barrier so that its metabolic reactions can occur quickly and precisely? A special kind of protein called an enzyme is the answer.
Well, in a non-biological system, the energy of activation is probably best provided by heat, by a flame. You can get the reactants to collide, and that provides the energy necessary to break the bonds to get it going. And then overall, the release provides the energy of activation, so you don't have to keep throwing matches at the chemical reaction. But obviously, inside of our body, enzymes are going to be the more logical source of a catalyst, because heat's going to really hurt most of our cells.
An enzyme serves as a biological catalyst, increasing the rate of a reaction without being changed into a different molecule. An enzyme does not add energy to a reaction. Instead, it speeds up a reaction by lowering the energy barrier. An enzyme is very selective. Its three-dimensional shape allows it to act only on specific molecules, referred to as the enzyme's substrates.
So when substrates fit into this active site, enzymes are thought to lower activation energy because they're able to collide and stress the bonds without a lot of heat, thermal agitation. So enzymes thus lower the energy of activations because they cause the bonds to break more readily without a lot of energy of activation.
As the substrates bind to the enzyme's active site, they are held in a position that facilitates the reaction. This takes less activation energy than the unaided reaction. Products form and are released. The enzyme emerges unchanged from the reaction. Because of the specific fit between enzyme and substrate, each enzyme can catalyze only one kind of reaction involving specific substrates. Thousands of different enzymes may be required to carry out all of a cell's metabolic processes.
That's a real benefit because each enzyme's specific, so therefore all these different pathways, like we said at the very beginning of the video, sort of like this big roadmap. Some pathways are going really quickly, some are going kind of slowly, and so it's great that each reaction requires a specific shape of an enzyme, and that's pretty cool. And so enzymes can regulate the rate of these pathways. And I just wanted to emphasize what was said a moment ago, which is enzymes, you notice, don't participate in the chemical reaction, they just catalyze it, and so they could be reused over and over and over again. So they're needed in just minute quantities, but yet the substrates are needed in larger quantities because we're constantly breaking those down. So that's kind of neat. So I hope you enjoyed this look at metabolism. Thanks for watching.